I'm Stephen Pattemove. I come from New Zealand. My family has been associated with the Rawai community for more than 40 years, close to 50 years. When I first came here, I came on a visit in the end of 1978. The village was very clean, spacious. People had been living here for a long time at that point. There was no walls along the seafront. There was one or two small shops, and the people were living in comparative peace. Although they had very little education, they had very little medical facilities. My wife's parents, David and Doreen Hogan, began contact with this community in about the middle 1960s. David Hogan did research on all of the tribes of the Isthmus of Kra, from the Moken up by Ranong all the way through down to the Malay border, into the forests of Patalung, where the Sakai people were, and wrote numerous articles, both for general purpose and for scholarly purpose, on the tribes of the south of Thailand. So although there had been some earlier publications about these people, he was the first to identify clearly the Moken, Moklen and Rawai as the three sea people tribes of the Andaman coast from Ranong down through to Satun. So he began having close contact with them in the late 1960s, and from about 1969, 1970 onwards he had very close contact and got to know them extremely well, lived in the village for many years. I myself came with my wife and began living in Rawai here in the beginning of 1985 after doing Thai language study, and worked with the Rawai communities for about 10 years from that point, before we moved back to New Zealand. And since then I've come every year, maybe twice a year, sometimes 3 times a year, to work and help the Rawai communities. So my father-in-law, David Hogan, has written most of the primary linguistic material about the Rawai language. I have followed in his footsteps, and I have also done research, and we've published some things together. And so we've had a very close connection with these people for a long time. No, when we first came here, I guess the problem of land rights didn't exist. Already by that stage, the land was owned by an outside family, but there was very little tourism, almost no tourism in Phuket at that time. Land had very little value, and so there was no issue. They made their living at sea, they bought things in the shop, so everybody was happy. There was no problems. It was only subsequently then the family began to sell off parcels of the land, and then sometimes the new buyers would want to push the chao le out, push the Rawai out. The original families, the problems with them were more to do with giving the Rawai some permanent status. When we first came, they would not allow them to build toilets. They would not allow them to put in electricity poles and more fire, because all of this meant permanent residence. So they would not allow that. Some people tried to dig toilets, and the landlord would come and sometimes get the police. And I remember the first time we tried to build a veranda for the community of Christians to meet on this veranda. The landlord sent for the police. the police came and confiscated all the wood, took it up to Chalong, and the police were not happy about this. They said, just quietly, wait 2 or 3 weeks, then come and get your wood. But they had to do what the landowner said. So they wouldn't allow new houses to be built. There was no, so people became, eventually people just built them. Overnight they would build a new house in between 2 old houses because they had to have somewhere to live. Families were growing. As health improved, so population increased. Population back in those days in the 70s was probably quite small, maybe, I don't know, maybe 500 people. Now I don't know what it is, maybe 1,500, 2,000, I don't know. And it's all squashed in the same area. So we've seen gradually over the years problems increasing. Place to live. Not being allowed to build on your own, the land you've lived on. I remember one day there was a man along the front here. His house was, the sao were all rotten and it was falling down. And so he had stored up the wood to build a new house, but he didn't build it. And one day some Thai people from Bangkok came by and asked him, why aren't you repairing your house? He said, oh, the landlord won't let me. They said, he can't do anything. You build your house. They gave them their nambat. Said, if you have a problem, we are lawyers. If you have a problem, you call us. So he built his house, and the landlord called the police and called the Jangwat, and they came and said, look, there's the high tide mark. This is still less than 25 meters. This is government land. You can't prevent him from building. So before, at the beginning, they had no self-confidence. They wouldn't stand up for their own rights. I was told stories about how they lost their rights in the first place. That the people came along and said, do you mind if we plant coconuts through your village? And they said, no, plant coconuts, fine. But as soon as he planted coconuts, he went and registered it as his coconut garden. And they lost their rights to their own land, even though they could have complained, but nobody told them. So there are very few records going back before this. Very few photographs, very few records. But I know from my father-in-law's stories that there were people here, and they used to go up during the monsoon season to Chalong, and they would have temporary huts in Chalong. But the people were here, you know, from my father-in-law's descriptions from the mid-1960s. It was mostly along the waterfront and a few houses further back, and gradually as the population increased they built further and further back from the beach. The stories that people tell us are that they lived in Lael, what's it called in Thai? I forget. Gohe. Yeah. And then they moved from there to here, or they were semi-nomadic. Originally they were not fully nomadic like the Mokken. The Mokken were fully nomadic, but these were semi-nomadic. So they would build banjak and live for a temporary period, and then they would move, the fishing was better somewhere else, and they would come back and they would have these semi-nomadic lifestyle. But since probably the 1950s, there's been a permanent residence, permanent village at least here. But I've talked to one of the grandfathers who's dead now here. He said he grew up as a small boy here at Rawai, and now if he was alive today he might be 90 or 100. So he was a small boy growing up in Rawai. That pushes residents here in Rawai back at least 100 years. And probably further. If you examine place names, even the name Rawai is almost certainly an Urak Rawai name originally. Why else would it have a Yor Yak Garam? What's the Yor Yak Garam doing? The Salah I is perfectly enough to say Rawai. But that tells you there's something, this is probably an Urak Rawai word which has been heard by Thai people and said, it doesn't sound quite like Raw A Salah I War Wang. So we put a Yor Yak garam on the end, and so I think that's almost certainly an Urak Rawai name that has remained here. Even our Chalong is from Selong, which are the Moken people. Any name like that, Chalong, is probably from Selong, like Ujung Selong, Jang Selon, the original name of Phuket when Europeans first came. It's often recorded as Jang Selon. That comes from the term Ujung Selong, which means the Cape of the Selong people. They didn't know there was a gap, a channel up at Tachachai. They thought it was a peninsula, and so they called it the Cape of the Selong people. The Selong are the Moken. So Moken people in Burma are called Salon, and here sometimes Selong. So many original place names here are originally from either Moken or Urak Rawai, which suggests that residents, their presence in these islands goes back many hundreds of years. When my father-in-law first came, there was already the landowner, I think it's the Mukti family, were already living at the frontier. But probably not for very long. I don't know what year they came. But when my father-in-law first came, they were already there. But the Urak Rawai had been here, been over at Got Hay, been on Got Bon, most places around they had been. We have linguistic evidence to show that they have been in Thai waters, in the Thai area, for probably 400 years or more. We've studied their language in comparison with Malay, and we know the differences between standard Malay and Urak Rawai. The interesting thing is that if you study the Urak Rawai language, there are very few words of Arabic origin. There are a few, but the Arabic influence on Malay came with the establishment of the Muslim kingdoms. And within the Urak Rawai community, there are a few Arabic words, but I can count only about 30, maybe 35. And none of them are specifically religious words. So it would seem to us most likely that these people are Malays who have never been Muslim. They've had contact with Muslim Malay communities, but they are Malay people who have never themselves been Muslim. Their religion is pre-Islamic Malay animism. And that suggests that they were cut off by the Thai border. Now you try and trace when was the Thai border fixed, when was there lack of communication between southern Thailand and you go back several hundred years maybe, when the Malay kingdoms were being set up. So they have been up here since probably around or before Islam became dominant in that region. So that doesn't tell us for a specific place where they were, but it tells us they've been in a Thai context for a long time. The language is so close to Malay. Urak Rawai is about 90% cognate with basic Malay. But it shows significant differences, and it doesn't have all the Islamic religious terminology. All the Islamic religious words are simply not known. They don't use them. But all the rest is Malay language with significant changes. So from the linguistic evidence, we think they have been here for probably 300 or 400 years in in what is now Thailand. Our personal evidence for their living here is from the mid-60s, mid-1960s. If I had many million baht, I would, the ideal for me would be for some muniti to buy the whole stretch of the beach from the main road to the Cape. the whole stretch, and to vest it in a trust so that it can't be sold, can never be sold, but give the people the right to live, to build houses, to plant some little gardens, to expand their village, to have facilities, electricity, running water, wastewater. Wastewater is one of the biggest problems in the village. You walk through the village and all of the wastewater is just collecting in the monsoon. Health is terrible from that point of view. You wade through filthy, stinking water because all the streams that went out to the sea have been blocked. So they need a secure place. Now, like anybody, if you give a person a bit of land and it's a chanod, and somebody says, here, I'll give you $1 million, they'll take the $1 million and they'll sell it like everybody else. But if it was a munity, if it was a trust that owned the land corporately, and they had the right to individual portions, to build houses, have electricity, health clinics, schools within the village, and the right to work at sea. They can't live if they haven't got the right to work at sea. And tourism has stolen their rights to the sea. They were here working the sea before anybody. They lived in harmony with the sea. I am a very passionate, very strong conservationist. And I know that the fishing practices of the Rawai have not always been good for the coral and the fish. Nearly always that has been because it's market driven. If there is a market for coral, they will take coral from the sea and sell it. If there's a market for blasoingam, they will catch blasoingam and they will sell them. But if there's no market, they won't do it. They've told me, look, we have lived here for hundreds of years. There is still coral. There is still fish. If we were not living sustainably, it wouldn't be there anymore. We would have taken it already many hundreds of years ago. So they need to be able to learn again to live sustainably with the sea. So sustainable fish traps, fish harvesting, maybe fish farming, but occupations which keep their connection to the sea. So they are still sea people. They could just go into inland and get jobs in Gangosang but they would lose their special identity. They are sea people, they need to retain their links with the sea. They need the right to earn their living at sea. Now maybe tourism may provide that right. Maybe they should become the people who are taking people more on the diving trips because they know the sea better than anybody else. So far tourism has only made land valuable, therefore they've lost their land. They've been shut out from all the beaches, all the reefs where they've normally fished. So all the way down the coast here, up the west coast, were all their fishing grounds. Across the islands, Gotracha, it's all their fishing grounds. And gradually they're pushed out, until now these fish trappers are about the only thing they can do. And even then, sometimes tourists come and break open the fish traps because they are sorry for the fish. Like I said, I'm a very passionate environmentalist, conservationist, but I believe these people need to relearn to live in harmony with the sea, as they have done for years, to live on the sea coast, to have security of land, and the facilities they need: electricity, running water, clean water and wastewater disposal, health clinics. Now the health system is much better. When we first came, they couldn't get any health help. My mother-in-law did a lot of medical work in the village. That's a dream. I mean, could you ever imagine buying up this whole land? Surely there are philanthropists somewhere with a little pile of money who could help us do that. Give them the privilege of continuing to be who they are for generations. I've learned that every day in our world, languages die. The world has about 6,900 living languages, and I think it's every 17 days one language disappears, something like that. This is a threatened language. Our work has been mostly on the linguistic side, as well as in teaching the Christian faith, but we have helped to preserve the language through dictionaries, through writing linguistic material, recording the language, and teaching them to read and write their own language. So there are many things that can be done to help, but the land is the fundamental. If you don't have security of land, forget everything else. Nothing else is of any use. Security of land means you can begin to think, how can we work with their occupation at sea? How can we help language retention? How can we help in better health care and better facilities for the village? There are many, many things which many organizations could join together to help these people. There are people I know of goodwill in Thailand, many people who would like to help. But maybe land tenure is the fundamental one. And we're all around the world, wherever people have lost their land rights, it's been the beginning of the end. So yeah, the problem with land is the key one. If they had the rights over their own land, plenty of people would be happy to help them put electricity and wastewater disposal and so on. But because land is owned by others, these things can't happen.
Ba chôm đa nhang mù lô, ba chôm